Dr. Max Baker-Hytch is a tutor in philosophy at Oxford. Dr. Baker-Hytch is a Christian philosopher, and much of his work is centered around epistemology and the philosophy of religion. Dr. Baker-Hytch has taught a range of classes, the likes of which include Christian faith and philosophy, philosophical theology, and philosophy of religion. So I hope you all join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Baker-Hytch.
Great, thank you so much.
Sorry, Max. Over to you.
Oh, no, you can carry on.
Could you start by just telling us a little bit about yourself and your work?
Yeah, sure. Well, firstly, thanks so much for having me. I was in person at Canford, I guess it was about 6-7 months ago, and had a really good time. So yeah, it's really nice to be back, albeit virtually. I have been interested in philosophy since about the age of 19. I actually didn't do philosophy at A-level, but I think, so I had a gap year and I was sort of trying to work out which subject I wanted to apply for at university. And I think my mum persuaded me, and I should say my mum was a philosophy and ethics RE teacher, and so she persuaded me that actually the kinds of questions that I'd always been interested in were sort of ones that I would get to study by doing philosophy. So I went off to Exeter University to do my undergraduate in philosophy and theology, actually as a joint honours, and yeah, basically just completely fell in love with the subject. I think it definitely was the case that the sorts of questions I'd always found intriguing were the ones that kind of philosophy gave me the scope to explore. So I then decided to go on to do a master's degree, and then I went to Oxford to do a DPhil, which is just Oxford's name for a PhD. Had a couple of sort of short-term academic positions known as postdoctoral fellowships. One was at Oxford, one was at a university in the USA, Notre Dame. And then I've been in my current position now for 7 years, I think. And as was just mentioned, I think it is fair to say most of my academic writing is sort of at that intersection of epistemology, being, the questions about the nature of rationality, evidence, knowledge, and so on, and philosophy of religion. So inevitably, a lot of what I work on has to do with questions about whether it's possible to have rational religious belief. That kind of looking at the latest state of play with various arguments for and against the existence of God. And one that I have been particularly interested in and have written quite a bit on in the last few years is the argument against God's existence from divine hiddenness. It's sort of the why isn't the evidence more clear? Why isn't there more of it, and that kind of thing? And isn't that itself an indicator that God doesn't exist? That sort of thing. So I hope that gives you a bit of a sense of the kind of thing I'm interested in, the kind of thing I work on.
Okay, hands up, guys. Questions? Yeah, Sammy, go for it.
I don't know if you saw, but either 2 days ago or yesterday, 2 alien bodies were brought in front of Mexican Congress. Whether or not those were real, I question whether that would be like sufficient grounds if alien life was proved to disprove our God as a Christian. What would you say that would be like enough evidence to disprove God?
Thank you. I need to read about that. I didn't realize that that has been put forward. Okay. I don't think so. I think, on the face of it, you might assume that Christianity is committed to the idea that human beings are the only intelligent life in the universe. But actually, I see no reason on closer inspection for thinking that the biblical account implies anything like that. I suppose I think that the most straightforward way to put the thought is that, if one takes seriously the idea that the biblical narrative could be a communication to humans from God, it would make sense that that communication was focused on what's relevant to human beings and doesn't really say very much at all about whether there's extraterrestrial life. And actually, C.S. Lewis, who was an Oxford professor of English, but also wrote quite widely on sort of philosophical, theological topics. He thought quite a lot about this question of basic aliens and Christianity and so on, and he kind of explores it in through the form of fiction in what's sometimes known as the cosmic trilogy, where he imagines sort of humans leaving Earth and going to explore other planets and encountering forms of intelligent life that don't seem to be kind of corrupted by evil selfishness in the way that humans are. And he uses that as a sort of lens, partly to explore the human condition, but also to think through this question of how God might interact with intelligent species that are quite different from humans. And I think he through that medium of fiction makes quite a compelling case for thinking that there could be all sorts out there in the universe, that's quite compatible with Christianity.
Do you, as a Christian and someone who studies epistemology, do you think there's anything you can know for absolute certainty regarding like your religious beliefs?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, the quest for certainty about anything, has been a theme throughout epistemology in the Western tradition. So, I mean, it's as you're probably aware if you've studied in any depth kind of figures like René Descartes or David Hume, there have been powerful arguments for thinking that actually we can't be certain or know really much of anything at all. And Descartes and Hume were both trying to see what can be salvaged of what we think we ordinarily know about the world. And Hume ended up in a way quite pessimistic. Descartes ended up thinking that he sort of ends up appealing to God as a way to say, well, if there's a benevolent God, then he could guarantee that our cognitive faculties, our minds, would be kind of aimed at truth, and that would be a sort of guarantor that we're not being systematically deceived, something like that. But so yeah, I think it's important to set this question in the context of certainty about any topic, and just to say, basically that is a long-standing kind of problem in philosophy, and what I think the theme that comes through there is that no one, in 2,500 years of philosophizing, no one has really come up with a really conclusive way to refute these radical skepticisms, like how can I know I'm not in the Matrix? How can I know I'm not dreaming? Obviously philosophers have had things to say about that, but I don't think anyone has come up with a really kind of really decisive, conclusive way to refute those possibilities. And so in that context, so I approach questions about God and religious belief with a kind of probabilistic mindset, which is to say I think in terms of evidence making certain beliefs more or less probable. So I'm okay with not having certainty in I think the sense you're thinking of about God's existence, or indeed about anything really. I'm content with probabilities, and so yeah, I guess what I want to say is that I think that there is a kind of there is a strong cumulative evidential case for the existence of God, but it falls short of certainty. But then again, I also think that's true of pretty much anything in life that's important.
Of all of the arguments for God's existence that you studied, which one do you think is the most convincing?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'll link this back to what I just said. So I prefer arguments that are probabilistic in nature rather than deductive arguments. So, a lot of the traditional arguments for God's existence, especially the ones that were popular in kind of the Middle Ages, were deductive arguments. So, most kinds of cosmological arguments are deductive, which is to say you've got some premises that are where it's claimed that if those premises are true, it logically follows that God exists. Now, I'm more of the persuasion that there aren't very many, if any, good arguments of that form. But rather, I'm more attracted to arguments such as the fine-tuning argument. So the fine-tuning argument starts with some data in physics, which is fairly broadly agreed by people across the sort of theist-atheist divide, about the way that, for example, the strength of the force of gravity, it turns out, had to be calibrated to an extremely precise value in order to yield a universe capable of supporting life, and such that if it had been different by even a really tiny amount, then no life would have been possible. So the idea with the fine-tuning argument as an example of a probabilistic argument is that that data, it doesn't logically entail the existence of God. It is logically compatible with God not existing, but or at least so the argument goes, it's much more probable that this data is much more what you would expect given the hypothesis of a God than given the hypothesis of naturalism. Now, obviously, there's debates around that, but in general, that's I think a form of argument that I can get behind. And the other thing about that kind of argument is it more resembles the way that detectives would build a cumulative case for convicting someone or charging someone with murder, where they would build up lots of clues, and each clue in isolation wouldn't clinch the case, but it's the accumulation of lots of arrows pointing in a certain direction that would be convincing. So that's why I'm often hesitant to sort of say there's one particular argument that I would want to hang the case on. So I do think fine-tuning is going to be included in that case, but alongside it are going to be various other things, such as I also think the phenomenon of consciousness and some of the properties that consciousness has is more what you would expect in a universe that is the product of a mind. I think certain aspects of the phenomenon of morality. Certainly, if one is persuaded that morality has sort of objective properties, then I think that's going to also sort of make more sense in a theistic universe than a naturalistic universe. So, yeah, those would be some of the arguments that I would be looking at.
Which do you think is the most convincing Christian response to the inconsistent triad?
Well, yeah, thank you. So the inconsistent triad is sometimes known as the logical problem of evil. So I think it's probably worth saying that the problem of evil discussion nowadays is not really focused anymore on the inconsistent triad, and that's largely because most people in the philosophical literature, whether theist or atheist, have come to think that that's not the strongest way to formulate the problem of evil, because there is a relatively ready response to it, namely the response that Alvin Plantinga gave, which is just to say that if one takes seriously the idea that a genuinely free act is one that even God couldn't compel someone to freely perform only good actions. So the thought is, well, if that's true, then if God wants creatures to perform freely chosen acts of good, then God can't block the possibility of freely chosen acts of evil. And so, yeah, that's really, and that establishes that God could allow at least some evil. Now, that's quite different from saying that God could allow the amounts and kinds of evil that we find in our world. And so the claim is not that free will by itself can account for the evils in our world, but it shows that there is a possible world in which God coexists with at least some evil. And because the logical problem of evil is making a really strong claim, namely that God can't possibly coexist with any evil whatsoever, all it takes to disprove that, all it takes to refute that argument is to show that it's possible for God to coexist with at least a bit of evil, which most people would agree Plantinga's argument successfully showed.
Is there anything that you would have to see or witness that would be able to disillusion you or disprove your faith to you? Like, what would you have to see or witness that would mean you were no longer a Christian?
Yeah, no, there's lots of things, I think. So in that sense, I am very much an evidentialist, and I think as such, one has to be open to scenarios where, I could acquire evidence of a sort that would massively undermine my Christian beliefs. So, okay, I'll give you an example. So some people say if the bones of Jesus were discovered. Now, in theory, yes, I would agree with that as being a scenario that would be refuting. The problem is, in reality, how could there be much assurance that they really were the bones of Jesus of Nazareth? So here's what I think would be a more realistic scenario in terms of being able to actually have some confidence in the scenario actually obtaining, and that's to say, suppose that we discovered a document purporting to be an eyewitness account of the life of Jesus, and after investigating it carefully, it looked like it had all the hallmarks of coming from a Jewish Palestinian eyewitness in the 30s AD. And let's suppose it's got there's lots of cross corroboration we can do with external sources and archaeology. And it has various hallmarks of authentic eyewitness testimony. And suppose this document portrays Jesus as really abusive towards people that he encountered. That would be a scenario where I would think, yeah, Christianity has been refuted. So that's just one example, but I'm sure one could think of others.
If things like the fine-tuning argument are true, and there is probably a God, what convinces you of the step further that God is the Christian God?
Right, thank you. So that's a great question, and I guess I think your question implied something which I would concur with, namely that there is a kind of two-stage nature to this inquiry. So I think it does make sense to first think of the investigation in terms of, is there some kind of transcendent supernatural or personal agency at work behind the world? And then secondly, if there is there any reason to think that agency has attempted to communicate with humans? Okay, so I think the form that second investigation is going to take is basically, it's going to be more historical in character, and it's going to be asking the question, is there any figure in human history or any group of people that look like they could be candidates for someone or some set of people that God is particularly communicating through? And so I think almost by definition, that's got to be someone who's had a big impact and whose fame has gone far and wide. Otherwise, that person wouldn't have been a successful vehicle of God speaking to humans, right? And so then I think it does make sense to look at the major world religions and the figures that they claim God has been speaking through. And so I think that then we can start to look at Jesus, Muhammad, the Buddha, and so on, and ask questions in terms of, are the sources about those figures, do they kind of, can they be corroborated by external sources? Can we cross-check them with archaeology, that kind of thing? And of course, there's a lot that could be said about that. I think if I can put it like this, even a fairly kind of skeptical liberal scholar like Bart Ehrman, when it comes to the historical Jesus and the Gospels, Bart Ehrman would actually accept a surprisingly long list of established historical facts about the historical Jesus, such as where and when he was born, the fact that he had this itinerant preaching ministry, taught in parables, had this reputation as a miracle worker, seemed to attract claims about himself being the Jewish Messiah, ended up getting crucified, and his followers certainly being convinced that he had come back to life, whatever explains that. So basically what I'm saying is that even the more skeptical people on the scholarly spectrum when it comes to Jesus will grant you a list of facts that basically looks like in skeletal form the story about Jesus that Christianity has told for 2,000 years. When it comes to the founders of other religions, in the case of the Buddha, we're really talking that the sources are more than 400 years after the Buddha's death. And it becomes really unclear kind of, with that kind of time gap, it becomes really unclear what is kind of just fable and what actually goes back to the historical man himself. And then in the case of Muhammad, we've got a sort of 200-year, if not more, gap between the man and the sources. And there's certainly difficulties there in terms of what those sources say about the places and that Muhammad traveled in, and trying to marry those up with anything that could be sort of cross-referenced with archaeology. There seems to be some big discrepancies there. So that's, and then I think there's a further stage to this as well, which is that, well, if we can establish that, we've got some historical knowledge about these different figures, are they the kind of people? Is this the kind of person or the kind of people that God might be communicating through? And so, and then I think there's going to be questions about sort of the type of ethical teaching that person gave, kinds of ways in which they treated people, the ways in which they behaved, and so on. So obviously that what I've just described, those two stages, the first, the kind of question of whether there's something supernatural or transcendent, and secondly, the question of whether we have some reason to think there's been a historical revelation. Those are kind of massive questions, each in their own right. But I hopefully have given you just a rough sketch of how I would think about trying to go about, investigating those questions.
Yeah.
Does morality come from God? And if so, is it possible that evolution could be a solution to the question of its origins?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I think a lot of people assume that theists are committed to giving the answer yes to that question. I actually am not so sure about that. So, for example, Richard Swinburne, who's a famous Christian philosopher that I'm sure you all have heard of, his view is that moral truths are a kind of necessary truths, a bit like the truths of mathematics. So like, the truth that a triangle has internal angles that add up to 180 degrees. In a sense, a triangle, the form of a triangle is not something that God creates, because it's a necessary truth. It kind of doesn't need creating. And so, there is this view that moral truths are a bit like that, in which case God doesn't create them as such. But it could still be the case that, we, in order for our minds to have reliable access to what the moral truths are, it needs to be the case that God has sort of set us up with the cognitive mental equipment that is reliably tracking those moral truths. So I hope that that's not a sort of dodge to the question, but I basically want to say it's not so clear to me that a theist has to answer the question yes, where the question is, did God create morality or does it come from God? As for evolution, that's an interesting angle on the issue, because there's lots of reason to think that our moral intuitions have evolved. I mean, indeed, if evolution is true, and I accept that broadly speaking, evolution is true, all aspects of our brains and our cognitive functioning have been shaped by the evolutionary process. Now, there is an interesting debate going on in moral philosophy right now around this type of argument that tries to say that, well, given that an evolutionary process would just be sort of shaping our minds and specifically our moral intuitions in ways to try to get us to survive and reproduce, but it's not per se aiming at getting us to have true moral beliefs, well, then why would we trust our moral intuitions? Why would we think they're reliable? A philosopher called Sharon Street has particularly pushed that argument. And I think that's an interesting argument. But I think what I would just say is, well, look, if we're in a naturalistic universe, then there is no mechanism that could kind of superintend evolution or ensure that evolutionary process gets us to have moral intuitions that are tracking the truth. But of course, if God exists, then there is a mechanism that could ensure that there's some kind of fit between our evolved moral intuitions and the objective moral truths.
Max, just thank you so much for agreeing to do this. Very much appreciate it. Just one question from me. Can you recommend to these students an entry-level book into philosophy? Is there any authors or a specific book you'd recommend for these guys to get into?
Yes, absolutely. So let me recommend two books. So one is a sort of historical overview, and another is a kind of a walkthrough of what it actually looks like to do philosophy, if you like, the methodology of philosophy. So there's Nigel Warburton has a book called a Little History of Philosophy, I think it's called. That's a really nice kind of bite-sized overview of the history of philosophy since I think it goes back all the way to Socrates. Very sort of quite short chapters, just giving a kind of succinct summary of a range of key figures in the history of Western philosophy. So that's Nigel Warburton. And then the other book I'd recommend is called A Philosopher's Toolkit. So that, and the author there is Julian Baggini, Baggini, I think, Julian Baggini, A Philosopher's Toolkit. So that's a really nice, introduction to actually the methods of philosophy, what it actually looks like to pick apart an argument, to demonstrate that an argument involves a contradiction, what it looks like to use thought experiments, that kind of thing. And it gives you a lot of examples of how these different methods have been used in different arguments in philosophy. So those would be two books I would recommend. There's a third book I'll recommend, and this is a bit self-promoting because I'm one of the authors, but there's this book that's just come out on more of the topics we've been talking about today. So it's the Cambridge Handbook of Religious Epistemology. So it's published by Cambridge University Press. And I wrote one of the chapters, the chapter on arguments about the existence of God. And this is a good resource. There's about 15 different philosophers have contributed chapters to it. And it basically gives you, a bit of a deeper dive into these questions around rationality, evidence, arguments about the existence of God, and so on.
Great, thank you. And just on that, as it's 2023, any recommendations for YouTube channels / websites that you use as a resource or you recommend to your students at Oxford? Yeah,
absolutely. So, I mean, I think a great one, if you, as I think the right way to approach this is to try and hear both sides of the debate. So a fantastic resource is The Unbelievable Show, which for the last, I think, 15 years has been hosted by someone called Justin Brierley. So The Unbelievable Show, you can find that both, on as a podcast, but also most of them were filmed as debates on YouTube. And so, Justin Brierley brings together, normally each episode will have a theist and an atheist, and they'll be discussing some question like, for example, well, yeah, did morality come from God? Does morality come from God, or is the New Testament historically reliable? And the neat thing about that is that the people he has are more or less the top people in the world that you would want to hear on these topics. So I'd highly recommend that. I'm trying to think what else. The Pan-Psycast is a good philosophy podcast. The Pan-Psycast, so that's Pan, P-A-N, Psy, P-S-Y, cast. So that's a really nice resource as well.
Thank you. Yeah, go on then, Elliot, final question.
How do you believe fate and free will fits into religion?
Yeah, good. So, I mean, there are some religious traditions, including some, strands within Christianity, and definitely within Islam, that think that more or less kind of God has foreordained everything that's ever going to happen in history. And so in a sense that those views have a fairly straightforward straightforward answer to your question, which is that there isn't free will, at least not in the kind of the intuitive sense that many people kind of hold to. So yeah, I personally reject those views. I think there are very strong reasons for rejecting those sorts of views. So yeah, then I guess I want to hold that human beings have what's known as libertarian free will, where libertarian free will is an account of free will where we basically have the power to do other than the thing that we actually do end up doing. And that's very much tied in with an idea that in order to be morally responsible for an action, it has to be the case that I wasn't predetermined to do that very action. There really was a genuine possibility that I could have done another one of the options at the time. So then that does lead to some puzzles for a theist in terms of, well, how can God know the future? If that's the case, if there's a sort of genuine openness to the possibilities that are before us, so that there's a lot to say about that. But yeah, in short, I would want to kind of reject views on this issue where it's kind of very fatalistic and everything's been predetermined. And I would add as well that I think that the problem of evil becomes more or less kind of insoluble. It becomes kind of that there's really no way to respond to the problem of evil for a theist who takes that view, I think, because then you're basically saying that God is directly responsible for absolutely everything that happens in history. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you to everyone for the questions, and most importantly, thank you to Dr. Baker-Hytch for giving us more insight into the historical evidence behind the Christian God and showing us a more in-depth relationship between faith and reason. Can we give Dr. Baker-Hytch a round of applause?
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. And it's great to be with you.
Thank you very much, Max. And a few of us are actually going to the Oxford panel event on the 25th. And you'll be there, won't you?
That's right. I'm doing a dialogue with my good friend Alex O'Connor. Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah. So looking forward to that. And and we'll see you then. But we really appreciate you taking the time today. So thank you very much.
No, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Final round of applause, guys.